David Johnson slumped into his worn recliner, his shoulders heavy with a weight he no longer tried to hide. Across the room, his mother Mary sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the muted television, eyes vacant, lips slightly parted as though caught mid-thought. It was the amnesia, David reminded himself, though he hardly needed reminding. Every day brought new frustrations, new forgetfulness, and new reminders of how far they'd both fallen. "Dinner's ready," he muttered, not bothering to check if Mary heard him. She didn't respond, just as she hadn't the last 5 times he'd called her to the table this week. In the kitchen, the modest meal of soup and toast sat untouched, a testament to the growing chasm between them. David sighed, staring at the peeling wallpaper and wondering how it had come to this. He once had ambitions, a career in real estate, dreams of travel, maybe even a family of his own. Now, at 48, his life had become a monotonous cycle of caring for a mother who didn't even remember his name half the time. It wasn't always like this. David's early memories of Mary painted her as a force of nature, working 2 jobs, scrimping and saving to give him a better life. But those memories were eclipsed by years of resentment, fueled by the slow, inexorable decline of her health. As he cleared the untouched dishes from the table, David's phone buzzed with a text from an old friend. It was an invitation to a dinner party, the kind of casual social event he used to enjoy. He almost replied before stopping himself. Mary couldn't be left alone. Not anymore. "You know," he said aloud, not expecting a reply, "this isn't what I signed up for." Mary's distant gaze turned toward him, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition. "David?" she murmured, her voice tentative, like she wasn't sure if the name belonged to him. For a second his chest tightened. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, and her eyes glazed over again. He didn't respond. Instead, he retreated to the small office where he spent his evenings poring over bills and calculating how long they could stretch their dwindling savings. His father had left them nothing but debts, and David had spent decades digging out from under them. A stack of unopened mail caught his eye, and among the envelopes was one addressed to Mary in a handwriting he didn't recognize. Curious, he tore it open. Inside was a letter from a lawyer, mentioning an inheritance from a distant relative. His heart quickened as he skimmed the details. A sizable sum, but only if Mary could prove she was being cared for adequately. David stared at the letter, his mind racing. An inheritance could change everything. Pay off their debts, secure better care for Mary, maybe even give him a chance to rebuild his own life. But the stipulations felt like a cruel joke. Caring for Mary was the very thing that had driven him to the brink. He folded the letter and tucked it into his desk drawer. That night, as he lay awake in bed, the wheels of resentment and desperation began to turn. David woke up to the faint sound of Mary shuffling down the hallway, her slippers dragging against the hardwood floor. It was an unwelcome alarm clock. He rolled over, pulling the thin blanket over his head, but the persistent sound forced him out of bed. In the kitchen, Mary was standing in front of the open refrigerator, her hand hovering aimlessly over a carton of milk. "Mom, what are you doing?" David asked, his voice sharper than intended. She turned to look at him, her face a mixture of confusion and fear. I was going to make tea," she said softly, though the words came out unsure. David sighed and gently guided her to the table. "I'll handle it. Just sit down." As Mary settled into her chair, David noticed a familiar envelope on the counter, the same one he had opened the night before. He had tucked it back into its envelope hastily, but now it seemed to mock him with its presence. The letter inside was addressed to Mary but written in his late father's handwriting. David hadn't seen his father's penmanship in decades. It was like a ghost reaching out from the past. His father had left when David was only 12, disappearing without a word and leaving Mary to pick up the pieces. David unfolded the letter again, reading the words more carefully this time. "To my wife, Mary Johnson, and our son David. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. I know my departure caused you both pain, but I wanted to make amends in the only way I knew how. I've left an inheritance that should provide for you, but there are conditions. The money can only be accessed if Mary is under adequate care, verified by a legal guardian or medical professional." David's grip tightened on the paper. The inheritance wasn't just significant, it was life-changing. It could wipe out their debts, pay for Mary's care, and even give him the chance to start over. But the conditions felt like a cruel twist of fate. Adequate care. What did that even mean? Wasn't he already doing enough? Every day felt like a battle to keep things together, and now it seemed his father was judging him from beyond the grave. That evening, David sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out before him. His frustration simmered as he calculated the logistics. The inheritance was within reach, but the cost of maintaining Mary's care would eat into it substantially. Still, the thought of walking away from the money was unbearable. As the hours passed, his thoughts turned darker. What if he didn't have to meet the conditions? What if there was a way to get the inheritance without bearing the burden? He caught himself and shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I can't think like that." But the thought lingered, and deep down, David knew he wasn't going to let the inheritance slip through his fingers. The next morning, Mary sat at the table, humming a tune David didn't recognize. She seemed oddly at peace, her amnesia shielding her from the storm brewing inside her son. David stared at her, the resentment and guilt warring within him. "Mom?" he began hesitantly, "do you remember Dad?" Mary looked at him, her expression softening. "Your father was a complicated man," she said, her voice distant. "But he loved you, David. He really did." Her words cut through him, and for a moment he felt a flicker of shame. But it was quickly overshadowed by the image of the inheritance letter sitting on the table. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll take care of everything," he said, more to himself than to her. As Mary looked up at him with a faint, confused smile, David's resolve hardened. The inheritance was his way out, and he would do whatever it took to claim it. David sat at his desk late into the night, the letter from his father lying next to an empty coffee mug. His laptop screen glowed with a search engine result: long-term care facilities for dementia patients. Each option he clicked left him more discouraged. The costs were astronomical, far beyond what his modest income could cover. Even with the inheritance, the financial drain would leave him with little for himself. The more he thought about it, the more his frustration morphed into a dangerous blend of desperation and justification. His life had been a series of sacrifices: dropping out of college to help his mother after his father left, foregoing promotions at work to be home for her appointments. Surely he deserved something for himself. His thoughts spiraled as he paced the living room. The idea came suddenly, almost absurdly: what if he left her somewhere? Not a care facility, but a public place where she'd be found and cared for by someone else. An airport. The thought struck him as strangely practical. Airports were crowded, filled with security personnel, and equipped with services to help stranded or lost people. She'd be taken care of and he'd be free. David immediately rejected the idea, shaking his head. "That's insane," he muttered. But the thought lingered. The next day, as he helped Mary with her morning routine, the idea began to solidify. She asked him the same question she'd asked the day before: "Where's the dog?" They hadn't had a dog in 20 years. "Did you call your father?" A man who had been gone for decades. Each question felt like a needle pricking his patience, and by the time he sat down with her for lunch, his decision was made. He began planning meticulously, convincing himself it was the best option for both of them. He searched online for flights and bus schedules, deciding on a busy regional airport an hour away. He packed a small bag for Mary, just enough to make her look like a confused traveler rather than someone abandoned. In the following days, David rehearsed what he'd say if someone asked why he was leaving her alone. He practiced a worried tone: "She wandered off while I went to the restroom." The lie tasted bitter, but it was necessary, he told himself. The night before the plan was set to unfold, David found Mary humming to herself in the living room. She looked peaceful, completely unaware of the storm brewing around her. "Mom," he said softly, sitting down beside her. She turned to him, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks. "You've been so good to me, David," she said, her voice trembling. He froze, the words hitting him like a blow. "Don't forget," she added, her expression distant again, "you're my whole world." David swallowed hard, guilt clawing at the edges of his resolve. But he pushed it aside. The next morning, David drove to the airport with Mary sitting silently in the passenger seat. She clutched her small bag, a faint smile on her lips as she stared out the window. At the terminal, David guided her to a bench near the check-in counters. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding as he looked at her. "Wait here, Mom. I'll be right back," he said, forcing a smile. Mary nodded, her expression trusting. David turned and walked briskly toward the exit, his chest tight with a mix of fear and relief. But as he stepped outside, the weight of what he'd done pressed down on him. For a moment he considered turning back. But then he thought of the inheritance and the fresh start it promised. He kept walking. As the doors closed behind him, the sounds of the bustling airport faded into silence, leaving David alone with his thoughts. David's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he drove away from the airport, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, but he refused to look back. "It's done," he muttered to himself. "She'll be fine. They'll take care of her." The streets blurred past him, the hum of the engine filling the suffocating silence. He tried to convince himself that this was the best choice for both of them. Mary would get the attention she needed, and he would finally be free to rebuild his life. But the gnawing pit in his stomach told a different story. Meanwhile, inside the airport, Mary sat quietly on the bench where David had left her, clutching her bag and looking around with mild curiosity. Her amnesia shielded her from the reality of the situation, but the confusion in her eyes began to grow as minutes turned into hours. "Excuse me, ma'am," a security guard approached her cautiously, noting her disoriented demeanor. "Are you waiting for someone?" Mary looked up at him, her face lighting up with an innocent smile. "Oh yes, my son. He'll be right back." The guard's brow furrowed as he observed her for a moment longer. Something didn't sit right. He gestured to a nearby colleague, and soon Mary was being escorted to a quiet corner of the terminal. As Mary answered their questions with fragmented, wandering responses, the security team reviewed surveillance footage from the terminal. It didn't take long for them to find the recording of David walking Mary to the bench, speaking briefly, and then leaving without returning. By the time David arrived home, his phone was buzzing incessantly. Ignoring the calls, he threw the device onto the couch and sank into his chair. He stared at the blank television screen, trying to drown out the rising tide of guilt. But the reprieve was short-lived. Less than an hour later, there was a sharp knock at the door. "Mr. Johnson, this is the police." "Open up." David froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he got up and opened the door to find two officers standing on the porch, their expressions grim. "Is there a problem?" he asked, feigning ignorance. "We need to talk about your mother," one of the officers said. David's stomach dropped as they stepped inside. The conversation was brief but damning. The security footage had not only exposed his abandonment but also sparked outrage among the airport staff. Social media posts about the man who left his mother at the airport were already circulating, drawing heated reactions from strangers who knew nothing about his struggles. "We're going to need you to come with us," the officer said. David's protests fell on deaf ears as they placed him under arrest. The charges weren't severe, neglect and abandonment, but the damage to his reputation was swift and overwhelming. By the time he was released on bail, news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines painted him as a heartless man who discarded his mother like an old piece of luggage. His neighbors avoided him, friends stopped returning his calls, and even his co-workers began to distance themselves. At the shelter where Mary was taken, volunteers worked tirelessly to make her comfortable. Despite her condition, Mary asked about David repeatedly, her voice tinged with worry. "He'll come for me," she said confidently. David saw her words replayed in a news clip, and it was like a dagger to his chest. The interview only fueled public outrage, with viewers calling for harsher penalties. Sitting alone in his darkened house, David realized the full extent of his actions. The inheritance that had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, the weight of his guilt breaking through the walls he had built around his heart. David sat at the dining table, his untouched coffee growing cold in his hands. Outside, the muffled sound of voices reached his ears, and when he glanced through the window, he saw reporters gathered on the sidewalk. Cameras clicked, and microphones were raised as they attempted to catch a glimpse of him through the curtains. He had stopped answering his phone after the first wave of calls from reporters and former friends. Each voicemail was a mixture of anger and disbelief, their words echoing in his head. "How could you do that to your own mother?" The public reaction had been swift and brutal. Social media posts about him had gone viral, branding him as a monster. News segments dissected his actions, complete with clips of Mary smiling kindly at volunteers who were now caring for her at a local shelter. David had watched one segment in particular where Mary, her memory faltering, spoke gently to a reporter. "David is a good boy," she had said with conviction, her eyes soft and trusting. "He'll come for me. I know he will." Those words haunted him. Meanwhile, Mary had been placed in the care of professionals who were quick to recognize the severity of her condition. The shelter staff marveled at her gentle demeanor despite the circumstances. "She deserves so much better," one worker was heard saying in an interview, a thinly veiled critique of David. David, on the other hand, was facing the full force of public condemnation. The legal system, while measured, was still unrelenting. His arraignment had been brief but humiliating, with reporters snapping photos as he entered the courthouse in handcuffs. The charges of neglect and abandonment carried penalties that seemed almost merciful compared to the court of public opinion. A plea deal was offered, community service and a fine in exchange for avoiding jail time. But the deal did little to repair the damage to his reputation. At night, David found himself unable to sleep, his thoughts consumed by regret. He replayed the moment he left Mary at the airport over and over again, each time feeling the pit in his stomach deepen. He had told himself that the inheritance would justify everything, but now, even the thought of accepting the money felt tainted. One afternoon, while sifting through the pile of mail that had gone unopened in recent weeks, David came across a letter from the shelter. It was a brief update on Mary's condition, outlining the care she was receiving and noting her frequent inquiries about him. "She seems to believe you will visit her soon," the letter read. David set the letter down, his chest tightening. It was one thing to face the judgment of strangers, but the thought of facing Mary, of seeing her kind eyes looking at him with trust and hope, was unbearable. For days he debated whether to visit her. Part of him wanted to stay away, to avoid the shame of confronting what he had done. But the guilt had become a constant, suffocating presence, and he knew he couldn't ignore it forever. Finally, on a gray afternoon, David drove to the shelter. The building was modest but clean, its entrance flanked by flower beds that someone had carefully tended. As he stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread greeted him, a stark contrast to the cold dread settling in his stomach. A staff member recognized him immediately, her expression a mixture of pity and disapproval. "She's been asking about you," the woman said, leading him down a quiet hallway. When they reached Mary's room, David hesitated at the door. Through the small window, he could see her sitting by the window, humming softly to herself as she gazed at the garden outside. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. "David?" Mary turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face lighting up in recognition. "I knew you'd come." Her words hit him like a blow. For a moment he couldn't speak, the lump in his throat too large to swallow. Finally he managed a choked response. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. Mary tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. "Sorry for what?" David sank into the chair beside her, his hands shaking as he reached for hers. "For everything," he said, tears streaming down his face. Mary smiled faintly, her memory too fragile to grasp the full weight of his apology. "You're here now," she said simply, patting his hand. David nodded, his guilt a heavy burden that he knew he'd carry for the rest of his life. David sat in the shelter's visiting room, nervously tapping his fingers on the edge of the chair. Across from him sat Elaine, one of the shelter's administrators, holding a folder labeled Mary Johnson. Her expression was kind but firm as she slid the folder across the table. "We thought you should see this," she said. "It might help you understand your mother's story more fully." David hesitated, his gaze flicking between Elaine and the folder. With a deep breath, he opened it, revealing pages of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. The first page caught his eye, a financial ledger in Mary's handwriting, meticulously detailing expenses from decades ago. Rent, groceries, medical bills, all scrawled in careful columns. Among the expenses were payments marked David's tuition. "She worked multiple jobs to put you through school," Elaine explained. "Even after your father left, she refused to let your education suffer." David frowned. "I dropped out. It didn't matter." Elaine shook her head. "It mattered to her. She believed in you even when you didn't believe in yourself." David flipped to the next page, where a black and white photograph of Mary and his father, Henry, stared back at him. The picture was dated 1976, just a few years before his father abandoned them. Beneath the photo was a note written in Mary's neat script. "Henry's temper worsened after David was born. I had to protect him." "What does this mean?" David asked, his voice tinged with unease. Elaine leaned forward, her voice gentle but serious. "Your father was abusive, David. Physically and emotionally. Your mother never told you because she didn't want you to grow up resenting him. She endured it for years to keep you safe." David's chest tightened as he scanned the documents, each one revealing a layer of sacrifice he had never understood. There were hospital records with Mary's name, dated during the years his father was still in the picture. The injuries were listed as accidents, but the pattern was unmistakable. "She hid this from me," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted you to have good memories of your childhood," Elaine replied. "She never wanted you to feel guilty or burdened by the truth." David clenched his fists, his mind racing. All these years, he had blamed Mary for his hardships, for his stagnant career, for the financial struggles that had defined their lives. He had painted her as the cause of his unhappiness, never realizing the extent of what she had endured for his sake. The next item in the folder was a handwritten letter addressed to him, dated 10 years ago. David unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling. "Dear David, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer able to explain things to you myself. There's so much I wish I could have told you sooner, but I was afraid it would only hurt you. Your father wasn't the man you thought he was. He loved you in his own way, but his anger made it impossible for him to stay. I stayed because I believed in the life we could build together. Every decision I made was for you, even when it hurt me. I hope one day you'll understand that everything I did out of love. You were my reason for living, my greatest joy, and my proudest achievement. Love always, Mom." The words blurred as tears filled David's eyes. He felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him, leaving him free falling into a chasm of guilt and sorrow. All these years, he had clung to a narrative where he was the victim of Mary's dependence. But now that story was unraveling, exposing the selfishness and blindness at its core. "She gave everything for me," David said, his voice cracking. Elaine placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's never too late to honor that sacrifice," she said. "What you do from here matters more than what you've done before." David closed the folder, his resolve hardening. For the first time in years, he saw his mother not as a burden but as a woman who had endured unimaginable hardships to give him a chance at a better life. As he left the shelter that evening, David made a silent promise to himself and to Mary: he would make amends. David stood before the judge, the courtroom heavy with silence. His lawyer had warned him that the sentencing would include a public apology, but nothing could have prepared him for the humiliation of facing his actions in such a raw, unfiltered way. "Mr. Johnson," the judge's voice broke the silence, "your actions were not only neglectful but callous. While the court recognizes your mother's condition may have placed you under considerable strain, it does not excuse your abandonment. You will serve 200 hours of community service, pay a fine of $500, and issue a public apology." David nodded, his throat too dry to respond. As the gavel fell, he felt the weight of the room's judgment settle over him. Reporters were waiting outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as he exited. Their questions cut through the noise like daggers. "Mr. Johnson, do you regret abandoning your mother? How do you respond to the public outrage? Have you spoken to your mother since the incident?" David kept his head down, ignoring the barrage. The court-mandated community service was set to begin immediately, and he was assigned to work at a local senior center, an irony that wasn't lost on him. The senior center smelled faintly of antiseptic and freshly brewed coffee. David was handed a mop and bucket on his first day and instructed to clean the floors. As he worked, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from the residents. "Did you hear about that man who abandoned his poor mother? Unbelievable," one woman said, shaking her head. David felt his ears burn, though he kept his head down and continued mopping. Over the next few weeks, the work at the center became a strange kind of penance. The residents were kind, offering smiles and small talk as he tidied up their common areas and helped serve meals. Some reminded him of Mary, their frailty, their simple joys. One afternoon he was tasked with assisting during an art therapy session. The residents were painting on small canvases, their brushstrokes tentative but filled with purpose. "Would you like to try?" one of the women asked him, holding out a spare canvas. David hesitated, then took the canvas. He hadn't painted since high school, but as he sat down and dipped the brush into the paint, he found the act unexpectedly soothing. His strokes were clumsy, but they began to form a picture. A simple landscape with a house that resembled the one he'd grown up in. The public apology was scheduled for the following week. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, David faced a crowd of reporters and onlookers. His hands shook as he held the prepared statement, but when he began to speak, the words came from his heart instead. "I want to begin by saying how deeply sorry I am," he said, his voice cracking. "To my mother, Mary, and to everyone who has been hurt or angered by my actions, I have no excuse for what I did. I let my resentment and selfishness blind me to the love and sacrifices of the woman who gave me everything." He paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "My mother deserved better. I abandoned her when she needed me most, and I will carry that regret for the rest of my life. All I can do now is try to make amends and be the son she deserves." The crowd was silent for a moment, then questions erupted again, but David ignored them. He stepped away from the podium, his chest heavy but his resolve firm. That evening, as he finished his shift at the senior center, one of the residents approached him. "You know," the elderly man said, leaning on his cane, "it takes a lot of courage to admit when you're wrong. Most people would just run away." David nodded, his throat tight. "I'm trying," he said simply. "You'll get there," the man replied, patting him on the shoulder. As David drove home, he thought about Mary, her smile, her soft humming, and the unwavering love she had shown him despite everything. He knew the road to redemption would be long, but for the first time in years he felt like he was moving in the right direction. David stood outside the shelter, clutching a small bouquet of daisies. He had spent weeks working up the courage to visit Mary again, each day chipping away at the fear of facing her after all he had done. The memory of her trusting eyes, the way she had greeted him with warmth despite his betrayal, was both a comfort and a source of unrelenting shame. Today he was ready. When he walked into Mary's room, she was sitting by the window, gazing out at the garden. The sunlight framed her face, making her look as serene as ever. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression brightening. "David," she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine delight. He swallowed the lump in his throat and handed her the daisies. "Hi, Mom. I thought you might like these." Mary took the flowers with trembling hands, her smile unwavering. "They're beautiful. You always know how to make me smile." David sat down beside her, feeling the tension in his chest ease. They talked about the garden, her favorite flowers, and the meals she had enjoyed recently. Though her memory faltered, there were moments of clarity that felt like small miracles. Over the next few weeks, David made his visits a regular part of his routine. He brought her small gifts, a photo album filled with pictures of their family, her favorite snacks, a scarf to keep her warm on chilly mornings. Each visit was a step toward mending the bond he had nearly destroyed. As David spent more time at the shelter, he became increasingly aware of the challenges faced by seniors with dementia and their families. The staff's dedication inspired him, and he began to see his inheritance not as a lifeline for himself but as an opportunity to give back. He contacted the lawyer handling the inheritance and arranged to use part of the funds to improve Mary's care. She was moved into a private room with additional support from specialists who helped manage her condition. The changes were immediate. Her mood lifted, her days became more structured, and her overall well-being improved. But David didn't stop there. He started meeting with local organizations that worked with seniors, offering donations to fund programs for those with dementia. One initiative involved creating art therapy workshops, similar to the one he had participated in during his community service. He saw the joy it brought to the residents and wanted others to experience the same. At the suggestion of the shelter staff, David also funded a transportation service for seniors, ensuring they could attend medical appointments and social events without barriers. One afternoon, while helping Mary sort through her belongings, David came across a box of letters and mementos from his childhood. Among them was a crumpled drawing he had made when he was 5, a picture of a stick-figure family holding hands beneath a rainbow. The word "Mom" was scrawled in uneven letters above one of the figures. Mary chuckled softly as she looked at it. "You used to draw rainbows all the time," she said. "You always said they made everything better." David stared at the drawing, a lump forming in his throat. "I forgot about that," he admitted. "Well, I didn't," Mary said, her voice warm. "You've always had a good heart, David. Even when things were hard." Her words struck him deeply, and for the first time in years he felt a glimmer of pride. News of David's efforts began to spread. Local papers published stories about his initiatives, framing them as acts of redemption. While some remained skeptical, many applauded his commitment to making amends. David, however, wasn't doing it for public approval. Each project, each donation, each moment spent with Mary was a way to honor the sacrifices she had made for him. One day, as he walked Mary through the shelter's garden, she turned to him with a smile. "You've been so good to me lately," she said. "It reminds me of when you were little, always wanting to help." David's heart swelled. "I'm just trying to make things right, Mom," he said softly. Mary reached for his hand, her grip gentle but firm. "You already have," she said. That evening, David sat in his quiet home, reflecting on the journey he had taken. The inheritance was no longer a source of guilt or greed but a tool for change, a way to build something meaningful. For the first time in years he felt a sense of peace. David adjusted the knitted blanket around Mary's shoulders as they sat together in the shelter's garden. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the gentle rustle of branches provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "It's getting cooler these days," David said, breaking the silence. "Winter will be here before we know it." Mary tilted her head, her eyes squinting as if trying to place his words within a memory she could no longer grasp. "Winter," she murmured. "You used to love playing in the snow, didn't you?" David smiled faintly. "I did. You always made the best hot chocolate afterward." Mary's face lit up. "With marshmallows." You insisted on the little ones, not the big ones? David chuckled. That's right. You always knew how to make things perfect. These moments of clarity were becoming more frequent, small pockets of lucidity that felt like gifts. Mary's amnesia still cast a long shadow over her life, but her spirit remained unbroken. Their conversations grew deeper with each visit. David began sharing stories from his childhood, filling in the gaps that Mary's memory couldn't reach. Do you remember the time I fell off my bike and scraped my knee? He asked one afternoon, pulling up a chair beside her. Mary frowned, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think so, she said hesitantly. You sat with me for hours trying to make me laugh, David said, his voice soft. You even did that silly dance you used to do. A smile spread across Mary's face. Oh, I remember that dance, she said, a faint laugh escaping her lips. You thought it was so funny? I still do, David replied, his heart swelling with affection. One day, as they worked on a puzzle together, Mary suddenly reached for David's hand. Her grip was firm, her gaze steady. David, she said, her voice unusually clear, I know I've forgotten a lot, but I haven't forgotten how much I love you. David froze, his throat tightening. For a moment he couldn't speak. I've always loved you, she continued, her eyes glistening with tears. You're my boy and you always will be. David swallowed hard, blinking back his own tears. I love you too, Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry for everything. Mary smiled gently, her hand patting his. We all make mistakes, sweetheart. What matters is that you're here now. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. David made it a point to be present not just physically but emotionally, investing time and effort into rebuilding their relationship. He brought photo albums, played her favorite songs, and even danced for her in the living room, clumsy steps that made her laugh until her sides ached. One afternoon, as they sat by the window, Mary turned to him with a thoughtful expression. You're a good man, David, she said. David shook his head, guilt still lingering at the edges of his heart. I'm trying to be. You always were, Mary insisted, her tone firm. Sometimes we just forget who we are for a little while. Her words stayed with him long after he left the shelter that evening. For so long, David had defined himself by his failures and mistakes. But now, through Mary's unwavering love, he was beginning to see himself differently, not as a perfect son, but as someone capable of change and redemption. As the first snowfall blanketed the city, David arrived at the shelter with a bag of marshmallows and a thermos of hot chocolate. Together, he and Mary watched the snowflakes fall, their laughter and shared stories filling the room with warmth. In those moments, the weight of the past seemed lighter, replaced by the simple joy of being together. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze as David stood in front of the newly built care home. A modest crowd had gathered, including staff, volunteers, and families who had come to witness the opening of what was already being called a beacon of hope for those caring for loved ones with dementia. The care home, named Mary's Haven, was a dream realized. Using the remainder of the inheritance, David had worked tirelessly with local organizations to create a space where families could find support, resources, and respite. The home featured private rooms for residents, community spaces for group activities, and a lush garden filled with flowers that Mary had loved. David stepped forward, scissors in hand, and addressed the crowd. This place isn't just for those who need care, he said, his voice steady. It's for their families too. For the people who carry the weight of love and responsibility every single day. This is a place where they can find understanding, compassion, and community. The applause was warm and genuine as David cut the ribbon, officially opening Mary's Haven. Inside, the care home buzzed with quiet excitement as the first residents moved in. Mary was among them, her new room filled with familiar touches, photographs of their family, a quilt she had made years ago, and her favorite chair by the window. David visited her every day, bringing updates on the care home's progress and spending hours listening to her hum softly or tell fragments of stories from her youth. One afternoon, as David wheeled her into the garden, Mary looked around with wide eyes. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors painting a picture of life and renewal. This is beautiful, she said, her voice filled with awe. You inspired it, David replied. I wanted to create a place that felt like home, for you and for others. Mary reached out and touched his hand, her gaze steady. You've done something wonderful, David. I'm so proud of you. Her words filled him with a quiet pride. For years he had carried the weight of his mistakes, but now he was finally beginning to see the legacy he could leave behind. A legacy built on love and redemption. The care home quickly became a cornerstone of the community. David worked closely with the staff, ensuring that every resident received the care and dignity they deserved. He also began hosting workshops and support groups for families, sharing his own story in the hopes of inspiring others to seek help and find healing. Despite his busy schedule, David always made time for Mary. On quiet evenings, they would sit together by the window watching the sunset. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and gold, David brought 2 mugs of hot chocolate to Mary's room. She smiled as he handed her the cup, her hands trembling slightly. "You've come a long way, David," she said, her voice soft but strong. "I always knew you had it in you." David nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom." Mary leaned back in her chair, a contented look on her face. "You've made my heart happy," she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the care home providing a soothing backdrop. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, David looked at his mother and felt a profound sense of peace. In that moment, he realized that redemption wasn't a single act but a journey, a series of choices that allowed him to reclaim his life and honor the love that had carried him through even the darkest times. And as they sat together, mother and son, David knew he had finally found a meaningful life. What do you think about the journey of redemption David undertook? Do you believe he truly redeemed himself, or do you feel there was more he could have done? How would you have handled his challenges differently? If this story of love, loss, and redemption moved you, don't forget to like this post and share it with others who might need a message of hope. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds depth to the conversation. And if you want more stories like this, be sure to follow our channel for heartfelt narratives that explore the complexities of life. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life.